Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, both with the live people and the people online, who I assume are also alive, but they're alive. This evening's talk actually grows out of a project that I hooked up a couple of years ago with my colleague Rachel Stern in New York. She runs the Fritz Asher Society. Look that up online. It has amazing programs. And we thought we would do a book on this topic. And there is still a book in the offing. But for the time being, if you are interested in more than what I will say this evening, and some things that I will say this evening you won't find, there is an online exhibition of this title, Identity, Art, and Migration, on the Fritz Asher website, which you might want to look up. The idea came up because, as you heard just a few moments ago, we live in a time where the question of refugees is a pressing one. And with that comes the question of identity, because identity, whether personal or communal, is something that, of course, is made up of a combination of features. It's part of our DNA. It's what's in us physiologically. It's what we inherit from our parents, from our grandparents, from our ancestors. And on the other hand, of course, it's part of our language, the language that begets the poetry and prose that we read and write. It expands from that to include the music and the visual art that we produce. Our sense of self is defined by all of these different components, which are part of the culture, both verbal and nonverbal, with which we grow up. And if someone suddenly has to leave all of that behind, as in the example of the two families you mentioned, but as in the many examples of many people leading up to, even immediately following World War II and the Holocaust, you go to another place, you go to another culture, you go to another language. How do the elements of your identity survive? How are they, or how are they not successfully transformed or connected, hyphenated, to the new identity that is naturally going to be part of the new world of which you're part? So, for the purposes of the exhibition, I selected 7 artists during the time of the Holocaust, and they will be part of the book that will be appearing eventually. And I also asked 2 other individuals to write articles, one about the psychology of immigration, and the other specifically about how the United States was operating leading up to World War II with respect to wannabes, people who wanted to come to this country. Everyone is fairly up on that information because of the recent documentary film by Ken Burns, but he's finally caught up to some of us who have been thinking and writing and talking about this for a long time. What I want to do this evening is offer you a prologue and an epilogue, in addition to discussing not 7, but 6 artists from that time period. So my prologue is immigrants, specifically Jewish immigrants, who arrived toward the early part of the 20th century, during a period when literally millions, and among those millions of Jews, were coming from different parts of the world, primarily from Eastern Europe. And within that community, there were, of course, those who were becoming artists. If as an immigrant, adjusting my identity might be considered a difficult proposition, if I'm an artist, does that make it even more difficult? Am I that much more sensitive? Or as a practical matter, what I produced as an artist in the old world, where I had a community that spoke the same visual language that I spoke, that understood the kind of symbols that I used, and now I'm in a new world with a new visual language, can I convert to the new language? Can I come up with new symbols? Can my art be understood by those in the new place? Or do I have to refashion the art that I produce if I want it to be accepted? So my first character is Max Weber, or Max Weber, born in Bialystok in 1881. He died in 1961. He had come at the age of 10 to Brooklyn with his Orthodox Jewish parents. He wanted to be an artist. He started at Pratt. So think about this. He's 10 when he comes here. So he's a child. A lot of time, a lot of malleability to become what you want to become. And in 1905, so in his early 20s, after teaching in Virginia and in Minnesota, he saved enough money to go to Europe, which was still the center of the art world. And he studied at the Académie Julienne in Paris. And there he met artists like Henri Rousseau, like Henri Matisse, like that guy Picasso, you've probably heard of him. And he came back to the United States in 1901, and he's the one who's credited with introducing Cubism as an idea to the United States. You're looking here at one of his paintings from 1915. It's called Rush Hour. And you can see what he's tried to do is convey the sense of rush hour. All of this stutter of these geometric forms, both rectilinear and curvilinear, are part and parcel of the idea of conveying that idea to the viewer. What's interesting is that we were not quite, as a culture, the United States, our art scene, we were not quite ready to embrace Cubism to the extent that eventually we would. This is, I remind you, shortly after the beginning of World War I. I also remind you, we had been bound and determined to stay out of that war. We were very isolationist in mentality. So Cubism as a distinctly European phenomenon was not something even our art community was necessarily overly interested in engaging. An interesting thing about Weber is, next image please, that already by the end of World War I, this is a work from 1919, he had completely shifted stylistic gears. This is called Sabbath. It's from 1919. And for the next 20 years, this was the kind of style in which he painted. These rather elongated faces, very stylized. And it was also the subject matter that he typically painted, which is to say, overtly Jewish subject matter. So he went from having Orthodox Jewish parents to becoming a very secular Jew, and dealing with art in a very secular set of terms, to becoming overtly Jewish in the kind of subject matter that he produced. And this was the stuff, interestingly, that caught the attention of the general art world at that time. No two of these stories is alike, as you said. Next image, please. Another rather renowned artist who arrived around the same time, Raphael Sawyer, a little bit younger, born in 1899 in the Russian Empire, who came from a very artistic family. His twin brother Moses and he were both painters, but then so was his younger brother. They all did music, they all did visual arts. They had come to New York in 1912, fleeing the pogroms of the Russian Empire at that point. And this is an image that he painted a bit later on in 1932. It's called The Artist's Parents. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's an oil on canvas, as you can see. And it is characteristic of his style that his figures always have these dark, dark eyes that kind of seem to be staring into space rather than at you. But in this case, it's even more intense, it seems to me. Look at how he's constructed the image. There's a kind of pyramid. You go across the bottom of his mother's arms to his father's hand, and then you go up of their two sets of shoulders. And at the peak of the pyramid, you have on the console behind them that old black and white photograph, which we can identify, it's obviously from the old country, as a mother and child. And now we look at the way they look, not at us, not at each other. We notice his father is wearing a suit and tie, as if the minute he got out of bed, he put on that suit and tie, regardless of what he had to do during the day. I would suggest that they're very much still connected to the old country, which is symbolized by that picture that forms the peak of the pyramid. Outside that pyramid is the new world. Now, he didn't have to put that ugly light switch on the wall to the upper left, right? He's an artist. It doesn't need to be there, but it's there. It seems to me symbolic of this is the new world in which they don't ever quite feel comfortable. Sawyer himself, his brother, his brothers, his siblings, they grew up Americanized, but their parents perhaps never quite made a sense of, or felt a sense of belonging. Next image, please. Thank you. Another contemporary of Sawyer, so this is still part of my prologue in the early part of the century, is of course the renowned painter Ben Shahn, who was also born around the same time, 1898. He came from Kaunas, Lithuania, about 1906. So again, he's 7, 8 years old, to Brooklyn. And what we see from him is that he finds his vocabulary, he finds his métier by the 1920s, where he thinks of himself very much in terms of social and political ideas and themes. So here you can see this painting of the, it's called WPA Sunday, painted in the early 1930s, painted during the Great Depression. And you've got all of these guys kind of sitting on a stoop together and not quite sure what to do. It's a day off from work, which is probably minimalist anyway. He coined the phrase social realism to refer to the style of painting that he engendered, because he said, I always want to have a socio-political point to make. And my style is realist, by which he means quasi-naturalist, so that you never have any doubts of what I have in my mind. Next image, please. And that same style would apply as the world moved forward from the time of the Depression to the time of the war, and be reflected in works such as this, which is done in the middle of the war, in the mid-1940s. And of course, you can see by the language in the upper right that it's in France. And you can see that it's a series of Frenchmen that have been lined up on the other side of the barbed wire, are their captors. This is a war scene, and he did many war scenes intended to evoke and invoke a kind of sympathy for those who were suffering as a consequence of the war. But this is World War II. This is World War II. This is also the Holocaust. So those whom he's depicted here are still there in France, where this is going on because the French have been overrun by the German army. And most of France has come under German control. And as you may know, even the parts of France that were not under Vichy, if you were Jewish, it was still under one version or another of Nazi control. But what about those from France or Germany who were seeking to come here as a consequence of what was going on? And that brings me from prologue to the meat of my conversation with you this evening. Next image, please. Annie Albers, also born in 1899, still around. She's a contemporary of Ben Shahn and of Raphael Sawyer. She is from Germany itself. Her name was Fleischmann, was her maiden name. And she was born in Berlin. She wanted to be an artist. In 1922, she managed to come to the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was the school that was interested in revolutions in art, of bringing to a fever pitch the notion that art is not painting and sculpture and architecture. It's all the so-called craft arts that have to do with furniture design and have to do with the design of curtains and carpets and ashtrays. That's sort of an idea that was born in the late 19th century in a series of movements across Europe, called arts and crafts in England, called Jugendstil, in Germany and Austria, called Art Nouveau in France. Each country had a different name for this idea. And in fact, the creation of an art school in Jerusalem in 1906 by the Bulgarian Jewish artist Boris Schatz followed that kind of a model. When he was put into exile by the Ottomans during World War I, Schatz wrote a whole treatise on the various arts that could be created at Bezalel, 27 of them. It wasn't just painting and sculpture, it wasn't just architecture, it was, as I said, all these other craft arts as fully fledged arts. So the Bauhaus was part of that idea. And the Bauhaus moved from one place to another over about a dozen years of its existence. By 1933, under the Nazis, under Hitler, the Bauhaus had been closed down. And people like Annie Albers had to leave. She came from a very secular Jewish family. She had hoped to do painting, but at the time when she entered the Bauhaus, they weren't allowing women to do that. So they stuffed her into doing textile manufacture, of which she ultimately became not only a master, but an innovator in a dozen different ways. But she did manage to marry her professor, Joseph Albers, hence her last name, who was renowned as a painter and as a colorist. And so they left in 1933 to come to the United States because they had gotten an invitation to teach at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. Black Mountain College was a college trying to be in America what the Bauhaus had been in Germany, an innovative amalgam of different craft and fine art activities in which there was no qualitative difference between making jewelry and making paintings. So Annie flourished. She arrived here because her husband was already a heralded artist. But the thing was, he came from a lower class background than hers. Therefore, his English was minimal. She was from a middle upper class background. She'd been tutored by tutors growing up, so her English was flawless. So they arrived on the ship to New York Harbor, and she's the one whom all of the reporters are interviewing because she's the mouthpiece of the couple. So she already had front and center. And when they came to Black Mountain College, they were equally successful. Eventually, they would leave. They would come back up to New York. Could I go back to that previous image for a second? Thank you. But this is symptomatic, this particular work, which is a wall hanging in silk that was done already when she was at the Bauhaus in the late 20s, which was innovative in two ways, because it was injecting an abstract artistic element into what was traditionally a much more straightforward kind of hanging, but also the materials that she used. So she used tinfoil and she used cellophane. She used different elements that not only created a kind of scintillating effect, but also functioned in a functional way to make curtains that you wanted to hold the sound away more successful at doing that. So they come to Black Mountain and she's doing a lot of things. And eventually they leave, they go to New York. And the next image, please. And Annie already has an exhibition at MoMA, at the Museum of Modern Art, in 1949. So this is, of course, after the war. So her success between the time she arrives in 33, 34, and 49 is considerable. She has exhibitions all over the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, Joseph becomes the head of painting at Yale. They move up to New Haven. But then she gets a commission at Harvard to do all the designs for the carpets, the curtains, and the bedspreads of some fancy fraternity dorm. One reads between the lines that Joseph was a little bit kind of, and I don't think it was Harvard Yale. What did he know about Harvard Yale? He's from Germany. It was really, he supported her, but not too much recognition. You know, after all, I'm the man, she's my wife. It was kind of an interesting dynamic. One other thing about Annie Alberts, with her vast success, relatively late in her career, she lived until 1894. In the 70s, 80s, she got not one, but two different synagogue commissions to do Torah art curtains. She comments in an interview with some reporter, not too long thereafter, some journalist, that it was the first time, and it was something that made her think a lot, that she had a commission for a religious institution. A religious institution, generic religious institution. Not a word that it was a Jewish religious institution, that it was a synagogue. One gets from her very little sense of a Jewish identity that she had to leave behind, or that she no longer felt, or that she regained. The only inkling you get from Annie Albers regarding the Holocaust is she recognized that Joseph, very successful, who was Catholic, had to leave Germany because of her, who was Jewish, rather than her thinking about the Jewish condition in and beyond Germany that she left behind, per se, or even thinking of Judaism when it came to the design of a synagogue art curtain. It didn't drive her in that kind of direction, rather interestingly. Next image, please. Quite different in a number of ways is Eva Hesse, much younger, born in 1936, also born in Germany, but in Hamburg. And in 1938, so do the math, she was about 2, 3 years old. Her parents managed to send her and her sister, who was a couple of years older than she, on a kinder transport to the Netherlands, and eventually they got to the USA. One can only imagine the sense of abandonment as a 2, 3-year-old she must have felt. Mommy, Daddy, why are you sending me away? Why are you sending me away? The family got back together, of course, when the parents made it to New York. And they lived on the Upper West Side of New York in an area which was largely inhabited by German Jewish refugees. I remember my father used to say, "Ah, yeah, in their generation, they called it the Fourth Reich because it was so German Jewish." And you can imagine that the primary language that most of them spoke was German. So Ava grew up in a kind of automatic combination of being an American and probably both with a strong sense of being German, but also with a strong sense of being German Jewish. And more than that, or on top of that, in 1944, her father and mother were divorced. The following year, her father remarried. The year after that, her mother committed suicide, possibly, not necessarily because of what had happened in her relationship with her husband. My point is, when I look at Eva Hesse, I see loss, 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 loss. Having to leave when you're 3, growing up in this ambiguous kind of community, in a certain sense, feeling abandoned by your father. She's only 8 at that time. Then he remarries. No evidence that there was a bad relationship with her stepmother, but still. And then the following year, at the age of 10, she loses her mother. And yet she is enormously successful already as a teenager. At the age of 17, she has already gotten an internship and feature articles about her on the magazine 17. And her early work was painting. That's where she would come to again at the end. So this is actually a work from the tail end of her life, because I'll get to that in a moment. In 1961, she married a guy by the name of Tom Doyle, a sculptor, and she studied at Yale for a while under Joseph Albers, interestingly, who thought her a very promising student. She and her husband got a fellowship in 1965 to go to Germany, in an area of Germany which is, how shall I put it, fairly gray. And the place where the fellowship played out was in a former factory. So they had all the room they could want, but it's depressing. Moreover, her marriage was kind of already on the rocks by the time 5 years had passed in that fellowship. But the irony and the interesting thing about it is, next image please, is that it's there back in Germany, the Germany that had spat her and her family out, to which she has now come back for this fellowship and working in these rather unhappy conditions, both psychologically and physically. She starts to play around with all of these construction materials, latex and fiberglass and plastic and hoses and things of that sort. And she ends up becoming renowned by the time she comes back within a year of the return from Germany. She's already having a series of exhibitions, and she's considered a pioneer among the post-minimalists. She's also thought of as a feminist. She's also thought of a whole pile of things, some of which she may have been and some of which she may not have been. But here's the thing. We're looking here at one among many of her works that reflect this kind of innovative artistic creativity that she shows. It's called Hang Up. And of course, it's a verbal pun because it's hanging up on the wall. What do you hang on walls? Paintings. Well, you got a frame, don't you? Well, it's not a real frame, it's tubing over which her now ex-husband and her very close friend Saul Lewitt, he also had an internship at 17 magazine, but they didn't know each other at that time. Later on, they became very close friends. And reading between the lines, when he was interested in her, she was not. When she was interested in him, he was not. It never clicked that way, but they were always good friends. They helped her wrap this tubing with this kind of gray tape. And then she's got this wire, it's almost like thick telephone wire, coming out of it, hanging from it. It's a frame on a wall. Doesn't it make this a painting? But it's not a painting. Is it a sculpture? Because it's free of the wall. Well, it's not exactly a sculpture either. If you think back to the late Russian period, just before World War I, of the constructivists, she's like Tatlin, a constructivist. But if you compare her work to Tatlin's, Tatlin's is very harsh. It's very rectilinear. It's very sharp-edged. She injects a kind of graceful fluidity as a kind of dialogue with the rectilinear part of what she's got here. And that's what ends up making her famous. The painting that I showed you, which is untitled For Gioia, G-I-O-I-A, reflects 3 months during the summer of 1968 that she spent with a friend up in Woodstock in this little cabin. Can I go back to that previous image? And this is the cabin. You see, you've got 1, 2, 3. There were 4 rooms, and there's kind of a path along the side. So at first glance, it's of course abstract, but in fact, there's something representational about it. By that summer, she knew that she had brain cancer. And she was operated on 3 times. In the end, it failed. Her last work, she literally was dying while she was trying to complete it. She had friends, colleagues, students who were helping complete this enormous work that was part of her legacy. She passed away in 1970. Next image, please. Thank you. A third example of someone very different. Louis René Wilhelm, otherwise known as Louis René, born in 1921, so later in Vienna, who also escaped by way of the Kindertransports, and she just made it by the skin of her teeth because it was 38, 39. If you do the math, she was like 17, 18, 19, barely under the age where you could be put on Kindertransport, and she went to England, where the family that she was farmed out to was under the illusion that she was sent to be their maid, to be their servant, to be their nanny. She came from a fairly upper middle class background. This was not what she wanted at all. She was a caddy striper in a hospital for a while. Finally, she got word of the fact. Somehow her family contacted her. Her parents had managed to come to the United States. So she made her way to London, and eventually they were able to transport her to the United States to meet her family. And there in New York City, where she was, her mother noticed one day this advertisement that Fiction House, which was a well-known comic book design institution, was looking for, new employees. It was very much a man's business. But of course, the men are all off at war. So her mom said to Lily, why don't you apply? Because she was already drawing, painting her whole life. She had clearly an artistic bent. And so she ended up getting a job in the man's world as a woman, in part because the men were gone, but even when they were starting to come back, she had started to prove her mettle. So she started out kind of as a filler in of stories and designs that other people had created. By the end of the war, she's already doing her own stuff. And this was her most famous character, Senorita Rio, in Horror's Hacienda. And you see this female James Bond sword fighting on the roof, with her high heels, by the way, and her skirt up above the knees, and that racy décolletage. She is fighting against this nasty guy. And there are others which actually show Senorita Rio fighting against Nazis. And later on, Lily would say, she was my alter ego. She was brave. She would do anything that I was afraid to do. Except Lily was pretty brave herself. She passed away about 2 months ago at the age of 101 in New York City. And she had an amazing career, not only in the realm of comics, but she became a designer and an illustrator of children's books. Next image, please.
Excuse me, may I
Yes.
ask, did she continue in comics for?
Yes. Oh, yeah, a long time. There was a major exhibition about her work in Vienna about 2 or 3 years ago that also showed in New York. There was 2 comic book artists, she and someone else. So yeah, she did for years. And then she also branched out, as I said, into children's books. Then there's Arthur Szyk. Arthur Szyk was born in Poland, in Łódź, when it was essentially part of the Russian Empire in 1894 rather. So I've taken half a step back chronologically to one of those oldsters from the late 19th century, as opposed to Lily and Eva, who were firmly rooted in the 20th century in terms of their birth years. And he very quickly developed a reputation as a very fine artist. He went back and forth between Paris and London. His subject matter focused on the one hand on Poland, particularly once Poland definitively lost its independence. So he was part of this Polish government in exile movement to create sympathy for Poland that developed during the Second World War. He did Jewish subjects. I grew up remembering on my parents' walls these illustrations, these magnificent Haggadah and Megillah, all those kinds of things, which is amazingly intricate stuff that no one's seen since the medieval period. And he managed to come to the United States. By the way, it wasn't easy. He already was renowned as an artist. He came from England to Canada in July of 1940. And from Canada, it was easier. In December, he came to the United States, and that's where he ended up staying. And once he got here, his unique style expressed itself in a whole new range of ways. There's the word on the street, which no one has ever been able to validate one way or the other, is that Hitler had a price on his neck because he had seen some of Schick's illustrations and was so pissed off the way he was represented. Anyway, this is called Hitler's World. And you can see we've got the Fuhrer on the one hand, we've got his little mouse, Goebbels on the other hand, and all the rest of his characters, you know, Goering, and behind him, a kind of Hirohito-looking Himmler. And you can see they're planning the takeover of the world. They're kind of spinning it around. Next image, please. Here's another one, which is simply called Satan Leads the Ball. So you can see Satan there, and you can see Hirohito. And you can see, if you look, Hitler, you can see Goebbels, you can see Mussolini, you can see the whole kit and caboodle, you can see death heads. I mean, it's just amazing. And here's the thing, three things. Thing one, apparently there were more Arthur Schick drawings on GI tent walls than there were, what do you call it, pinups. That's how popular he was with GIs. Eleanor Roosevelt said of him, he's a one-man army with this man. So he was quite brilliant, quite successful. He turned his attentions after the war in other directions. There was an anti-immigrant congressman in California who was making up stories, and Schick just did a few drawings, and boy, did that man shut up quickly. The third thing, by the way, just in case anyone has any ideas, Schick designed a magnificent Torah art, so it's brass, for a synagogue in Queens. And that synagogue is 3 times the size now of the congregation to which it has shrunk. So they haven't moved out yet, but they're planning to. And of course, it would be wonderful to find a home for that art. So if anyone has any brilliant ideas, please share them with me. He is a spectacular artist, and one who really found himself before he got here, still had difficulty coming here, but then refound himself easily when he was here. So if we think back, we start with Annie Albers. Without missing a beat, she comes here. And there's very little connection between what she is and what she does as an artist and the Jewish part of her identity. We move on to Eva Hess, who was actually born here, but grows up in a kind of bilateral situation where I would say the defining element is lost, in part impelled by what had happened. Because the whole kinder transport thing, the whole being left behind by mommy and daddy in the first place would not have happened without the Holocaust. But then she sustains loss after loss. And then Lily Renee also comes as a youngish teenager and finds herself very much in a very unexpected way. And then we come to Arthur Schick, who is already accomplished when he gets here, like Annie Albers is, but has more difficult getting here than she had, and is very much engaged with his Jewish identity, together with his Polish identity, together with his American identity. Once the state of Israel came into being, with that part of his identity. Next image, please. Which brings me to Friedel Zubas, who was born about 1915, also in Berlin. And in 1939, he fled from Germany, was able to come to the USA, came to New York City, became very quickly engaged with what is known after, but this would be already by after the war, what's called the New York School, the Abstract Expressionists. He was in the 1950s sharing a studio with Helen Frankenthaler. He was exhibiting in the 9th Street exhibition of 1951 that was so famous. He was engaged with all of these guys, but by the 1960s, he's kind of shifted in his own unique sort of direction. So the abstract expressionists move this way and that way. People like Pollock and de Kooning, it's all actionist, it's all gestural, it's all wild and woody. The chromaticists, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Earl Gottlieb, are not exploding the world on their canvases the way Pollock and de Kooning are. They're putting the world back together again. It's a kind of secular tikkun olam on these large chromatic canvases. And Zubas kind of falls in between. There's a gestural quality here, but there's also a chromaticist quality. And the most interesting thing I find about him is it's like, I'm going to outdo all of them because his paintings are hugely huge. Next image, please. So this one, which is called Procession, if I can show you the next image, where the installation of it is visible, is just enormous. It's just enormous. So Zubas, by 1976, has left New York. He's moved to Massachusetts. He's teaching. He's painting. He's having one affair after another. He's having a good life, and that's where he lives until he dies in 1994. There's a sense in which one can't say, and he can't say, that you can make it here as an artist, except how many of you had heard about him before I mentioned it? But how many of you heard of Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko? My point is, he hadn't become a household word, and he was very conscious of that. So he felt embraced, accepted. He came here, he found himself, and yet there was a certain sense in which he felt that he didn't fit. A pause, next image, please. Lest you think it's only about Jewish artists, Jewish identity, Jewish immigration during this period. There were, of course, non-Jews as well, among the most famous of them being, of course, the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian, born in 1872. So I've jumped all the way back earlier than any of the people I've talked about with respect to his birth year. And he dies in 1944, only about a year after coming to the United States. He was born in Utrecht. And of course, he became known early on for these kind of semi-abstract landscapes. And then by the 30s, he started to stylize those landscapes to the point where you see a rigorous rectilinearity. If you've been to Holland, you get a sense of where he's coming from, the horizon line and the buildings. Everything is so neat and rectilinear, except punctuated by the color of flowers and the like. Well, here the two come together, except the colors are basic. Red, yellow, blue, the primary colors, black and white. This became, by 1935, this is a work of his called Composition at that time, that reflects that. And I see the next image, please. 1919 to 38, he's in Paris. 1938 to 40, he's in London. 1940, he comes to New York. And there, his rhythms become more syncopated. He becomes more colorful. And this is the painting of paintings, in my mind. I think it's at MoMA by Mondrian, that reflects the joy and jubilation he felt at coming to New York. It's called Broadway Boogie Woogie. As soon as I say that, you understand what's going on here. The lights, the colors, the action, the shapes, his own style that he has transformed in his own kind of unique way that we see reflected in the last couple of years before he passes away. Always wearing his suit and tie, by the way, as well. Always the consummate gentleman painter. None of these smocks covered with all kinds of pigment, but always very nattily dressed. Next image, please. End of the parenthesis. End of the parenthesis, back to the Jews. This is Rudy Lester. Rudy Lester, also born in Berlin in 1902. In the 1920s, so he's just out of his teenage years. He's being highly touted by Kate Polwitz and by Gerd Grosch as an etcher and a printmaker. He had a spectacular career in graphic arts and watercolors in front of him. 1933, while he's away, fortunately, from his studio, the Nazis come in and they absolutely wreck it. And when he comes nearby, he has friends who see him coming and say, don't go in, don't go back, leave. So he flees to Scandinavia, taking, in fact, his son with him. And he spends his time in Holland and then, in Denmark and then in Sweden until after the war, until 1946. So he spends the war years in exile from Germany, but not even trying or interested in coming to the United States. It's in Scandinavia. But in 1946, he learns that his brother and his mother had managed to come to New York. So he heads with his son to New York. And he ends up living in the United States for the next 10 years, 46 to 56. This, by the way, is an early work from about 1925, 26. As you can see, it's a rim tight. And so some of his work is sports themes. Some of his work, he's got a couple of works called pogroms, so there are certainly Jewish themes, you might say, of the most horrifying sort, and landscapes. And he's continued to produce after he has to leave Germany in Denmark, in Sweden, and now he comes to the United States in 1946. And because of a connection, he is able, probably 46, 47, to come to Washington, D.C. He's asked to found the printmaking department at Howard University. As you know, one of the important historically Black institutions of higher learning in the United States. And you may be aware of the fact that there were many such institutions who provided teaching positions for Jewish refugee professors who ended up in these various and sundry schools. So that's probably part of the context of Lesser being there, but this is post-war now. This is 46, 47. It seems that although he spent 10 years here and he got some good exhibitions and some good coverage, he never felt comfortable here. So you have Zubas, who never felt really that he had made it here. Then you've got Mondrian, who was a star as soon as he got here. Sandwiched between Zubas and Lesser, Lesser never really quite felt comfortable here. So in 1956, he went back to Berlin. And he lived in a fairly slummish part of Berlin. He had his dog, he had his chess game, he had the cafe that he would visit all the time. And someone said, yeah, you could always see him with his back to the window. You always saw him. And if you went in, he's sitting there at the chessboard, and he's sitting there having his little schnapps, and he's got his dog, and he's got his briefcase, and he always has some sausage in the briefcase that he's giving to the dog. That was kind of his image. Oh, and he's always got a beautiful young blonde on the other side with the dog. Next image, please. He traveled a lot. He went to France. He went to Spain. He seems to have been quite comfortable. The promise that Kollwitz and Gerd Grosch had seen in him, if success is measured by the people who know of you and the people who are patronizing you and the people who are buying your work, he was a founder. If you go by, are you happy? He certainly appeared to be happy in Berlin from 56 until he died in 1988 at the age of 87. And what you're seeing here is a self-portrait, in fact, that he did an etching, did the year before he died in 1987. And the funny thing is about it, you can't quite tell the age. If I said he did this in 1927, you probably would say, yeah, okay, he could be 25. But he did it in 1987, he's 85. You can't, it's interesting. And his signature style has a certain expressionist quality. We've got all those lines as if there's some imperfections across the image, but that's intended there. And the face kind of merges with those imperfections and merges with its background. So each of these characters exhibits a very different kind of experience and a different kind of response to the experience of coming here easily, coming here not easily, coming here just as war was breaking out, coming here after war had ended. And they form a part of a vast array of individuals who did not make it, because the number of Jewish artists who we don't know about, but who had promising careers because they perished at the hands of the Nazis, or they did have careers that we only came to learn about 20 or 15 or 10 years ago, like Felix Nussbaum or Shalat Solomon. The number is incalculable. They form the meat of a sandwich between my prologue, which looked at immigrant artists like Ben Shahn and Raphael Sawyer and Max Weber, and next image, please, and my epilogue. Michael or Misha Yofin was born in Leningrad in 1959. I met him in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, just when the Soviet Union was breaking apart. A friend of ours introduced me to him, and we remained in contact until just before COVID. We kind of ran out of contact, and then I was interested. I kept calling, and there was no answer. And then I looked on his website, and it had a deceased date of 2020. I'm guessing COVID, but I'm just not sure. He came to the United States in 1991. He moved to San Francisco. And that's the year that he painted this painting. which you can see, it's called the 4th of July. And you can see it's a diptych. And on the right side, we've got the American, and on the left side, the Russian part, both the Cyrillic Yulia, but also look at the houses, look at the roofs, look at the smokestacks, look at the trees, look at the telephone poles, even look at the sky, virtually feckless, with clouds accumulating. The American flag to the lower right, the Russian flag to the lower left. It is as straightforwardly symbolic a statement of a painter immigrant as one could hope to find. It is his two identities. And he certainly, from my point of view, managed to continue to create and find new ways of expressing himself. But the challenge for him was he had a whole vocabulary of symbols that a Russian audience would get, that an American audience typically would not. So it was a matter of transforming in a number of different ways. And as I say, he continued to work until he passed away in 2020. Next image, please. My last epilogic part of this is another youngish artist, David Stern, born in Essen, Germany in 1956. So he's born 10, 11 years after the end of the Holocaust, whose work I exhibited in the early 90s when I was directing the Klecznik Museum. And this is one of the works that was exhibited during that time period in 1993, 1994. David and his wife, and then now 3 children, managed to emigrate from Germany to come to the United States in 1994. It's interesting that he said to me, I've got to get out of this place because I don't feel it's a place I want to bring up my kids Jewish in Germany. And you can see that his style is a very intense, figurative, abstract style. This is from a series called Identity and Relationship. The exhibit that, as I said, I mounted at the Klecznik in 1994. You can see it's a couple together. It is about love. It's all about relationship. It's all about people. The figure is at the same time have a kind of intense abstract feel to them. And the paint is so thick, these are practically relief sculptures. It's kind of a tradition that you see with Van Gogh that then is one-upped by Soutine, who is one-upped by Frank Auerbach. That's one-upped by David Stern with the kind of work that he does here. And it's all about emotion. All right, how do I recreate myself now? It's the end of the 20th century when I come to New York. I'm not sure whether or not he was sure for the first 6 or 7 years that he got here. And then how's irony for that? How's this for irony? 9/11. Next image, please. And he really found the way to redirect the same sort of an idea. It's about people, it's about relationships, in works such as this from 2002 called The Gateways. And the thing, by the way, about this stuff is if you're up close, it just looks like blocks. So the idea with which the Impressionists began in the 1860s, that if you're up close to a Monet, it looks like blobs. And you have to step back to a certain point until it coalesces as haystacks or the Rouen Cathedral. And by the way, no two of us will step back to exactly the same point because no two of us have exactly the same eyes. And if I look at the same painting in the early morning, I may stand in a different place from where I'll end up in the afternoon because my eyes are somehow different. This whole idea of the relativity of how we see, and therefore the relativity of the absolutes we call color, for example, we say red, but the way I see that red is not the same way you're seeing that red. And not only that, I can't tell how you're seeing it differently from me because only you know what it looks like and only I know what it looks like to me. David is playing with that kind of an idea. He paints with his brushes on these 10-foot poles. So he's seeing from a distance what he's doing. It's quite a virtuosic kind of activity. And this work ended up in the National September 11 Memorial and Museum in New York City, where it was on exhibition for about 5 years. So from Max Weber to David Stern, we're dealing with a whole range of diverse examples of art and the expression of comfort or discomfort, success or failure, acceptance or rejection, in how identity is translated in moving from where I was as an emigre to where I'm coming as an immigrant, And that issue, as important as it was during the time of the Holocaust, is, as we heard before it began, every bit as important today in different ways for different people, but with the same kinds of concerns. So I thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm happy to continue. So, any questions from the crowd here, and we'll go back and forth to see if anyone's in the chat.
I wonder if any of these artists got a diary detail how they
Yes,
through
some of them did. Ava has had a little bit of diary stuff. She had actually a fair amount. Annie Albers, some, but more we know because she got interviewed rather late in life and she talked a lot. I mean, the whole business about her and Joseph when she got the commission at Harvard, that comes out of that. The business about this commission from the two synagogues and her response to that, or her response to the Holocaust being that Joseph was forced out of Germany rather than, oh my God, I was a Jew, what was happening to the Jews? All that comes from those interviews. Rudy Lester, Zubas, not much by way of diary. Who did I leave out? Whoever else I talked about, not as much diary-wise. We also have letters sometimes, which gives us stuff. Any other questions from the crowd? From the group? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a material that we could send to the talk? I'm trying to remember all of this.
Well, may I suggest the simplest thing? Write this down, or Fritz Asher Society, or I'll provide Becky with the information, and if you help point her, she'll, if you bother her enough, she'll give it to you.
We'll send it out in our
The Fritz Asher
post-program.
Society website has the exhibition, which doesn't have everything that I have here, but then it has stuff that I didn't talk about here, obviously. So it's a different animal, but you can get a lot more information from what I and others wrote in that website. And eventually I'll do it via phone. Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, the other thing that
We charge an extra by the
I didn't get the impression that when these people came, they had a great deal of material on it. They seemed to have a support system. And they seemed to have a community of other people that they were in the same situation. I wonder how that affected.
Yeah, I would say the exception to that is Lily Renee. They were really just living by the skin of their teeth. She and her mother, and that comic book job kind of was their salvation, but she didn't have an infrastructure. Rudy Lester clearly did, but he still wasn't happy. I think Zubas had a bit of an infrastructure. Certainly Annie Albers, big time did. Ava has its altogether different story because she's, her family was part of this community in which she grew up. So for the most part, I think you're right. But at least in one case, not really much of an infrastructure, a supportive infrastructure. So that made it that much more challenging. But obviously, well, I'm thinking of fast forwarding to Michel Yoffin. He knew people who, like himself, had already come from what was by then being called St. Petersburg to San Francisco. In fact, briefly, he and another artist had organized a kind of tandem. They called it SFSP, San Francisco, St. Petersburg. But neither of them had particularly like galleries that were very supportive of them, that would make it easy to make a living as an artist. And both of them, the other guy's name was Raphael, struggled with the question of how to translate their art into what would make it palatable to Americans. There have been a number of artists from the former Soviet Union, Jewish and otherwise, who have made it, many more that have not. I think the artists from the former Soviet Union, Jewish, who most effectively translated themselves into something they were Homer and Muhammad. And they just figured out America very quickly. And they did a number, and they also have a huge sense of humor. So, they sent out a questionnaire about what features do you most like about a painting? Color, this, that, and the other thing. And they kind of Then they wrote this up and then they painted a painting, a landscape, based on what the majority had said they liked. And so they said, so this is what Americans like in landscape painting. You know, which is very clever. They first went to Israel before they came. And they did this whole installation where Komar came first and Melamed came later, about a year later. And when Melamed arrived, they did the sacrifice of the third temple. And they built this structure and they placed the suitcase of Melamed on the structure. And of course, Komar is almost a pun on a word for priest, and Melamed is a pun on the word for sofer, for scribe. So it's kind of the priest and the scribe. And they sacrificed the suitcase. And at the top of this structure where the suitcase has been sacrificed, there was the red star, the Soviet star. So they did a lot of very clever things which captured a lot of attention. Whereas many of the artists whom I met when I visited a few times at the end of the 80s, who then managed to come here, did not find it easy to refine themselves as artists. And I think that was probably true also with respect to those who managed to come here during the Holocaust, and it would have been true. And it will be true of any time. That's the whole point. Your identity is caught up in certain things. Can you reshape your identity? And if you're an artist, so your reshaping of your identity is going to mean a reshaping of, in some ways, of your art. Can you do it? And not everyone can, but some can.
There's a few questions online.
Go ahead.
The first one there is,
Yeah, 1,000 people online.
I think this one is sort of maybe continuation. Hopefully it's not a repetition of what we were just talking about here, but someone's interested in how we sort of liberated in particular and how like the painting, like talking about the painting having like beforehand versus afterward. If there's anything else you want to say about that further.
Just that in some cases, one can, if one charts that individual's career, see a dramatic change. And in some cases, when I look at Annie Alberts, she found where she was in the 20s at the Bauhaus, and she continued to elaborate. But if you look at that, let's say from 1925, and work that she started to do in the end of the 80s, early 90s, when she gave up doing material, what do you call it, textile, and started to do printmaking, but the same kinds of designs, you realize there's not a huge shift between before and after when she came to the United States. But she's my poster child for someone who, as I said, I think 3 times in the course of my talk, kind of didn't miss a beat when she got here. And I'll confess that it bothers me that she didn't skip a beat, that there is no consciousness of all those being, to pun, beaten down while she wasn't skipping a beat. And maybe it's buried in there, but there's no evidence in anything that she said that she felt that way, as I said, except for that one little, Joseph had to leave because of me. That was it. Whereas, yes, in some cases you have before and after, which is dramatic. Next question.
Thank you. The one person was interested. Much of your presentation were two-dimensional artists. Is there anything to say about more three-dimensional artwork and sculptures?
The same rules apply. The thing about going from one place to the other, depending upon the circumstances of your departure, is that if you're a painter, you may actually be able to bring stuff with you. There is a wonderful artist from the former Soviet Union by the name of Felix Lembersky. And by the way, on the Fritz Asher Society, there's a program March 15th where I will be speaking with his granddaughter. When he died, his widow and his daughter managed to bring a lot of his stuff to the United States. So his daughter and his granddaughter have spent the last 30 years trying to promote his work. That's how I first became in contact. When I was running the museum, Yelena came to me and said, would you show his work? Well, I would have, but I was gone from the museum before I could have the opportunity. But the point is, obviously a sculptor could not easily do that. So there's a fundamental way in which you're starting from scratch. But yes, sculptors and not just painters fall into this category of shifting cultures, shifting realities. In the case of Michel, by the way, by about 2005, he stopped painting and turned instead to sculpture, abstract sculpture, monochromatic sculptures. You know, he put all these pieces together and spray paint them, very dramatic, somewhat reminiscent of Louise Nevelson style. I don't think he knew that, but so he actually made a change from painting to sculpture at a certain point. That only half answers the question, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you. I actually, I mean, I actually saw a Netflix special on someone who was a sculptor who lost most of his works. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I was trying to look it up here real quick. It's and I'm not going to say the name correctly, but it's The Life and Lost Art of Skulkowski. I mean, yeah. So
Well, that also, of course, sure, that happened.
yeah.
I mean, Chagall came to Paris in 1909, and he went back to Russia shortly after World War I broke out. He had to go back. And at the end of the war, he was put in charge by the new Soviet government of the arts at Vitebsk, which was his hometown, in fact. But by 1924, for reasons beyond this discussion, I don't want to bore you, he left. He went back to Paris and found that his studio had been completely just wrecked. And the people he ran into said, "Oh, we thought you were dead." Fortunately, Chagall had been successful enough that he already had a studio in Berlin as well. But also, he was the kind of artist who simply repainted all the stuff that was lost. So some artists can do that, right? Some would say, "Oh my God," and all right, I'll just leave that and move forward. Chagall repainted most of the stuff that had been destroyed in his absence. So no two stories in that.
There's a question here. What about Nina Cass, who went to Israel?
Yes. What about her in what sense? Change? No change?
The question was left in however you want to go with it.
You just continue to flourish there. Of course, Israel is a whole other story because you have more artists, demographically speaking, per capita in Israel than in any country in the world. I'm remembering, because I don't keep updating my statistics necessarily, but in 1965, that's a long time ago. At that point in time, when Israel's population was roughly 2.5 million, there were 2,500 individuals who identified themselves in the formal sense claiming to be artists. So do the math. How many people would that mean in the United States? So Israel is a whole nother kind of story, and it's been a very dynamic and dramatic one. Going back to the idea of creating art at Bezalel, as I mentioned in 1906, as part of the Jewish nationalist idea that if it's going to be three-dimensional, it can't be just political, it can't be just spiritual, it's also got to be cultural. So you need art and you need music. And Schatz, was the court painter and sculptor to the king of Bulgaria, Ferdinand III, when they were trying to assert their independence from the Ottomans. So when he was drawn to Zionism, the whole idea of creating Jewish art was kind of what underlay his founding of the school. And then over the next 120 years or so, 160 years, you see an amazing range of gyrations. You start with, we're here to stay. You end with, what are we? And everything in between.
Thank you. Yes. And, another question. It's not that I'm not familiar with the organization, but you asked if there were many artists who were part of the WPA frameworks, as well as another
So part of the program that FDR put in place to try and lift us out of the depression was the work public administration, however it's called, WPA. So artists were actually given jobs. If you go down to what's the building that it now is? It's it's right around Judiciary Square, and there's all these wonderful relief carvings of upper reaches of the building. You see that too, but I'm thinking of a different building. It's right around there, yeah.
There are a bunch of courthouses.
Yeah, but there's one with all of this, and it's all stuff that was carved by people like Chaim Gross during that period. So yes, Raphael Sawyer, Ben Shahn, Chaim Gross, there's an endless list of artists who actually found employment from the federal government in the Works Project Administration, that's what it stands for, by doing these different works of public art, murals. You know, sometimes public murals can backfire. This was not WPA, this is pre-WPA. Diego Rivera was imported by Rockefeller to do a spectacular mural in New York. This was about 1928, and Ben Shahn cut his teeth on being an assistant for Diego Rivera. But Diego Rivera was a socialist and not a communist, and it was very evident in the subject matter and the way he depicted it. And Rockefeller was horrified, had the whole thing destroyed. But among other things, that inspired Shahn to be really more aggressively socio-political. The image of his, which I think is most significant that I didn't show, is the Sacco and Vanzetti in 1932. The Italian immigrants from New England who were accused, probably falsely, of having committed a murder. Neither of them spoke English that well, so they couldn't really defend themselves. And the WASP organization that didn't like the idea of these dirty, scuzzy South European immigrants who don't speak our language, won't be part of our country, set them up. And Shahn commented at one point, there's someone who wrote memoirs, said, you know, I wish I lived during the time of the crucifixion. That would have been something bad. I have something, Sacco and Vanzetti. So they became for him the crucifixion. And there's a whole series of these gouaches, and there's one which is called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti, which is just spectacular in terms of the language it's speaking with respect to the miscarriage of justice and the interweave of art and religion and politics. Anyway, so yes, he started out with Diego Rivera, and Diego Rivera is a forerunner of what's going to happen with the WPA in terms of public art projects of mural painting and relief art.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the audience here?
Well, I thank you all very, very much.
Yeah. Thank you.